It was the second week of August 1943. In Louisville, Kentucky, more than 90 men and women of the 807th Medical Air Evacuation Transport Squadron boarded 2 railroad cars for an unknown destination overseas. They were part of an experimental Army Air Forces program evacuating wounded soldiers by air. Most of them had never flown before. The program was barely a year old. These young nurses and medics were pioneers, and they did not yet know what awaited them. Among the medics was 21-year-old Harold Hayes. He had been drafted into the medical department and volunteered for air evacuation training. In the officer's car sat 28-year-old Agnes Jensen, a nurse from Michigan who had joined the Army looking for adventure. She had never flown before. They were both part of the 807th, a squadron still learning its trade. None of them suspected that their own survival would soon depend on those untested skills. This is the story of how a routine medical evacuation flight became a desperate struggle for survival in Nazi-occupied Albania. But first, the men and women of the 807th had to reach the war. Their convoy docked at Béziers, Tunisia in early September. The port was a ruin of twisted metal and collapsed buildings. German air raids still hit the harbor at night. It was their first taste of combat, and they realized how far they were from the quiet training fields of Kentucky. From Tunisia, the 807th moved to Sicily, setting up headquarters in Catania. The nurses were billeted in a villa overlooking the Mediterranean. The medics bunked in a former military school. By late October, they had evacuated more than 1,600 patients. Then came the morning of November 8, 1943. Captain McKnight, the squadron's commanding officer, decided to send half his medical personnel to the Italian mainland. The wounded were piling up at Bari and Grottaglie, and storms had grounded flights for 3 days. 13 nurses, 13 medics, and a 4-man flight crew boarded a C-53D Skytrooper, a variant of the rugged C-47. It was a transport plane stripped of armor, designed to carry paratroops, not to fight. The pilot and his co-pilot had never flown together before. They lifted off around 8:30 in the morning under a sky that seemed clear enough. Within 15 minutes they crossed the coast of Italy and flew into trouble. Dark clouds towered ahead. The weather was far worse than the forecast. Thrasher tried to climb above the storm, but ice formed on the wings. The de-icing boots had been removed for summer and lay unused in the cabin. The magnetic compass failed. Radio contact with Bari was lost. Flying blind, the pilots attempted to land at an airfield they spotted, only to take anti-aircraft fire from German fighters on the runway. They fled into the clouds again, low on fuel, and finally spotted a dried lake bed. Thrasher put the plane down hard. The landing gear sank into mud, the tail flipped up, and the fuselage slammed back to earth. In that moment, the 30 men and women on board realized they were in Nazi-occupied Albania. Medic Harold Hayes and the other dazed survivors had barely climbed from the wreckage when armed men in fezzes and coarse woolen shirts emerged from the woods. Their leader stepped forward and asked in broken English if they were British. Co-pilot James Baggs replied they were Americans. The leader smiled and explained they had landed in Nazi-occupied Albania. His men had been ready to shoot down the plane until they spotted the white star on the fuselage. Gina led the party through dark woods to a small village where the Americans crowded into a cramped room above a stable. The villagers offered them cornbread made of nothing but cornmeal and water, along with sour white cheese. When the party awoke the next morning, their musette bags had been ransacked. Soap, razors, socks, and mess gear. Anything the Albanians recognized had been stolen, leaving the travelers with few supplies and uneasy trust. That same day, the men returned to the crash site to destroy what remained of the plane. They opened the fuel valve and soaked the ground with gasoline, but the first attempt to light it failed when the fumes exploded, knocking the man nearest the door onto his back in the mud. That evening they tried again. A lit torch thrown into the pooled fuel finally worked, and the C-53D went up in flames, its blackened skeleton left to rust in the Albanian marsh. On the 4th day, the partisan leader led the party down into the valley toward the town of Berat. Thousands of cheering villagers lined the streets, throwing flowers and saluting the Americans with clenched fists. The townspeople believed the uniformed men and women were the first wave of an Allied invasion force. An English-speaking partisan official greeted them at a simple hotel and arranged a feast of mutton and sweet soup. But Kostek Stefa made no move to help the Americans reach the coast. Instead, he marched them through Berat in an old orange Fiat truck, stopping at the Martyrs' Cemetery, the castle, and partisan headquarters for speeches about the resistance. At each stop, the party was taught a clenched fist salute and expected to respond with partisan slogans. Agnes Jensen and the others grew restless and confused. They wanted escape, not political rallies. A photographer posted half a dozen pictures of the uniformed Americans in a shop window on the main street for all who passed by to see. Kostak Stefa seemed more interested in showing the villagers that Americans were fighting alongside the partisans than in finding a path to the coast. German intelligence, meanwhile, learned of the crash survivors' presence. The window of opportunity was closing fast. On the morning of November 15th, Harold Hayes and Robert Owen awoke to the sound of gunfire. Their host burst into the room with a worried face and said the Germans had entered Berat alongside members of the anti-communist Bali Kombetar. The party scrambled toward the orange truck as artillery shells exploded nearby. With the injured crew chief Willis Shumway limping alongside, they piled into the back and sped out of town. A German Messerschmitt appeared overhead and began to strafe the road. The truck stopped, and everyone scattered into ditches and behind boulders. Hayes dove into a puddle as bullets kicked up the ground around him. Agnes Jensen landed in the mud nearby, pressing herself flat. After a pause, a second wave of planes returned, and the party scrambled once more for cover as the truck was hit repeatedly. When the strafing stopped, the truck was wrecked, riddled with bullet holes. Those who had made it out took cover behind a riverbank. As the group regrouped and headed for the mountains, they realized 3 of their number were missing. Nurses Wilma Lytle, Ann Manis, and Helen Porter had been left behind in Berat when the attack began. There was no going back. The rest pushed into the hills alone in a country at war with itself. In the chaos following the Berat attack, Harold Hayes, Robert Owen, and Raymond Ebers found themselves separated from the main party. They pressed ahead on the trail, only to be caught in a sudden crossfire between partisans and the anti-communist Bali Kombetar. The 3 medics dove behind a boulder and then into a stone building where the rest of their small group had taken shelter. Inside, a wounded partisan lay on the floor, barely conscious. A nurse told Hayes that the man likely would not survive the day. When the group moved out under cover of a partisan barrage, they left the wounded partisan behind, knowing he likely would not survive. The afternoon wore on with sporadic gunfire, and the group remained trapped. Their young partisan guide, Kani Sikeka, came up with a plan. An hour before sundown, the partisans laid down a heavy barrage, and under cover of the noise, Kani led the Americans out of the building and down the mountainside. They climbed through the blackness, holding onto each other's belts to stay together, and finally reached an empty stone barn where they collapsed onto piles of hay. After days of walking, Kani's group reunited with the main party in the village of WWII. There were hugs and handshakes, but the celebration was cut short by a head count. 3 nurses, Wilma Little, Ann Manis, and Helen Porter, were not among them. No one had seen them since the attack on Berat. With little food left in the village, the combined party pushed on, and on the last day of November, they stumbled into the mountain village of Levdar. There they met a fair-haired British officer in full uniform, Captain Victor Smith of the Special Operations Executive. Captain Smith was astonished that the partisans had led the Americans so far east, close to German-occupied Corsair. He immediately sent a radio message to SOE headquarters in Cairo to alert the United States military that the party had been located. He also arranged for food and a few pairs of shoes for the nurses whose soles had worn through. After a brief rest, Smith led the party to his base at Khrushchev, a village buried in knee-deep snow. At Khrushchev, Major Alan Palmer introduced the SOE team that would guide the Americans to the coast. A stack of gold sovereigns was handed to pilot Charles Thrasher, heavy coins stamped with the profile of King George V, meant to pay for food and services along the way. The party also met Lieutenant Gavin Duffy, a tough demolitions expert with a handlebar mustache, and his wireless operator, Sergeant Herbert Bell. Duffy, who had parachuted into Albania back in April, took command of the escape effort. The weather turned brutal as Duffy led the party westward through heavy rain and fog, with the cold seeping through their tattered uniforms. The trail was slick and treacherous, and the constant dampness left everyone shivering. Rations were scarce, and the mules struggled to keep their footing on the muddy slopes. Despite the misery, the group pressed on, knowing that every step brought them closer to the coast. The march continued through rain and fog over swollen rivers and makeshift bridges. In every village, Duffy had to haggle for mules and food while the villagers, themselves starving, shared what little they had. One afternoon, an aging man told the Americans he had a pair of shoes for them, but they were far too small for any of the men. Hayes later wrote that the man was simply giving what he could, and they thanked him anyway. The worst climb came on Mount Nemerska, which Duffy later called the most difficult mountain in Albania. It took 7 hours of switchback trails and driving snow. When the exhausted party finally reached the mission at Sheper, they were greeted by Major H.W. Tillman, a world-famous mountaineer. Tillman produced a bag of shoes dropped by parachute, along with leather vests for the enlisted men. Hayes grabbed a pair that was too large, traded them with Owen, and promised to give them back after the journey. On the 20th of December, with the party still stranded in Albanian villages near Sheper, pilot Charles Thrasher had reached the end of his patience. 43 days had passed since the crash, and the coast remained tantalizingly out of reach. Without consulting Lieutenant Duffy, Thrasher ordered Sergeant Bell to send an unauthorized radio message directly to the 12th Army Air Force. He described the group's desperate condition. Half were sick, shoes were falling apart, and morale was shattered. He requested an immediate air evacuation from the abandoned Italian airfield near Gjirokastër, promising partisan protection and no enemy aircraft in the area. Christmas found the Americans scattered among Albanian villages. The nurses spent the eve singing carols by a small fire, and an Albanian family served them chicken and wine. Agnes Jensen had bet medic John Wolfe $1 that they would be home by Christmas. The day came and went, and Wolfe collected his $1. They were nowhere near the coast, but they were alive. Lace-ridden, exhausted, half-starved, but still moving. That, after 2 months behind enemy lines, was something close to a miracle. The message was forwarded to Allied headquarters, and within days a massive rescue operation took shape. The Army Air Forces committed more than 30 aircraft to the mission: Lockheed P-38 Lightning fighters, a British Wellington bomber, and 2 C-47 transport planes. Duffy was furious when he learned what Thrasher had done, but there was no turning back. The plan was set for December 28th, then delayed by weather and communications failures. By the morning of the 29th, the exhausted party had left their mountain hideouts and trudged through the cold to a hillside overlooking the Gjirokastër Valley, carrying the yellow-orange parachute panels that would signal the planes to land. Duffy reached the ridge first and raised his binoculars. What he saw stopped him cold. The town of Gjirokastër was swarming with German troops. Tanks, armored cars, trucks, and soldiers occupied the castle and the main roads. A column of 3 trucks and an armored car moved down from the town and parked near the airfield itself. The rescue planes were scheduled to arrive within the hour, and there was no way to warn them with the enemy in position. Signaling a landing would be suicide. Duffy made the only decision he could. He refused to put out the signal. He told the party to wait and watch. At noon, the roar of engines filled the sky. 21 P-38s appeared in perfect formation, circling the valley with terrifying power. A Wellington bomber swept low over the runway, followed by 2 C-47s, their machine gunners poised for action. For the men and women huddled on the hillside, it was the most beautiful and heartbreaking sight they had ever seen. The planes were so close they could see the pilots' faces. Then Duffy changed his mind. He shouted for the men to grab the signal panels and run down the hill. They sprinted across the field, but by the time they reached the edge of the runway, the sky was empty. The planes had gone, the rescue was over, and the party was left alone in the silence, staring at the empty airfield. It was January 6, 1944. The survivors had spent 60 days behind enemy lines, and their morale was at its lowest point after the failed air rescue. They were gathered on a trail near the village of Kalarat when a bearded man in a United States Army captain's uniform appeared, limping hard and leaning on a cane. He carried a .45 caliber pistol on his belt and wore the shoulder patch of the Army Air Forces. He introduced himself as a United States Army captain, though he was secretly an officer with the Office of Strategic Services sent specifically to bring them home. Smith used gold sovereigns to hire new muleteers. He also negotiated with armed Bali Kombëtar patrols that guarded the mountain passes, trading on the reputation he had earned during an earlier mission into the country. The party pushed through snow and rain, climbing steep trails toward the coastal range. Lawrence Abbott, a medic who had swapped places onto the flight to repay a personal loan, walked alongside Harold Hayes, whose shoe sole had been patched with wooden pegs that kept breaking loose. By the time the column reached the ruined village of Turbach, the men could see the Adriatic Sea glimmering beyond the last ridge. They were close enough now to taste the salt. That evening, they reached the cave base called Seaview, a shallow hollow in the limestone that overlooked the water. The place was crawling with lice and black scorpions, but it was their last stop before freedom. A tall wireless operator named Don Orahud had been living in the caves for weeks, and he immediately raised the OSS base in Bari on a small handy-talkie radio. The boat was already underway. Around 10 o'clock that night, the party stumbled down a steep path to a narrow beach. Orahud's radio crackled with the voice of Lieutenant David Brody, who was counting in German from the deck of a British motor launch idling offshore. Inflatable rubber boats ferried 4 or 5 people at a time through the surf toward the dark shape of the launch. Agnes Jensen climbed up the netting with her musette bag still slung over one shoulder. Harold Hayes and John Wolfe were the last to leave the sand. As Hayes swung a leg over the launch's railing, the British skipper opened the throttle and the boat surged into open water. For the first time in 63 days, the 27 Americans were no longer inside enemy territory. Hayes stayed awake on the bridge past midnight, watching the Albanian mountains shrink to a gray line on the horizon. The 3 nurses left behind in Berat, Wilma Little, Ann Manis, and Helen Porter, had been hiding in the home of Nani and Goni Karaja for 4 months. The family had dug a crawl space between their cellar and the neighbor's house for emergencies. On the night of the German attack, Nani's brother Kichi had convinced the searching soldiers to spare the nurses by reminding them of past business dealings. The women had spent the winter playing bridge and learning Albanian words from a borrowed dictionary. In March, a Bali Kombatar officer brought them false identity papers. Lytle was renamed Arife Hamitaj, a Muslim housewife from Gjirokastër. On March 18th, wearing homemade skirts and headscarves, the nurses were driven out of Berat in a car and a pickup truck. Their driver got lost, they had 2 flat tires, and they passed German guards twice. After walking through the night, they reached the shepherd's hut where Lloyd Smith was waiting. Smith led them over the mountains to Seaview in a single forced march. On the night of March 21st, an Italian motor torpedo boat took them off the beach, ending their 135-day ordeal. All 3 nurses reached Bari alive, completing the rescue of every last American who had gone down with the C-53D on that stormy November morning. After the war, Harold Hayes used the GI Bill to study aeronautical engineering and lived to be the last survivor of the 30 who had boarded the plane. Agnes Jensen returned to Bowman Field as an instructor and at nearly 85 published a memoir of the ordeal under her married name, Manjaric. Gavin Duffy was awarded the Military Cross and lived quietly in England until his death in 1990. Lloyd Smith retired from the Army as a lieutenant colonel with a Distinguished Service Cross and was buried at Arlington National Cemetery. Charles Thrasher returned to the United States but was killed in a plane crash in 1945. James Baggs returned to Savannah and lived until 1995. Lois Watson worked as a psychiatric nurse at a veterans hospital in Kansas. She told her daughter that the Albanian mountains had taught her she had only herself to depend on. Lawrence Abbott wrote a memoir of the ordeal published after his death. Robert Owen married his sweetheart from Bowman Field and lived a long life in New York. John Wolfe returned to Wisconsin and lived until 2008. Hassan Jinnah, the partisan who first met the crash survivors, died in 1986. Kostak Stefa was executed in 1948 by the communist government for collaborating with the Allies. Willis Shumway recovered from his injuries and returned to civilian life. Herbert Bell was awarded the Military Medal for his wireless service in Albania. The rescue of these Americans from Nazi-occupied Albania required the courage of ordinary villagers who, guided by the ancient code of Besa, fed and sheltered strangers at the risk of their own lives. It also required the stubborn will of men and women who simply refused to stop walking. The final image that stays with us is not a boat or a cave, it is a face. Agnes Jensen standing on the hillside above Gjirokastër as 21 P-38s filled the sky. She knew she could not signal them. She knew she would keep walking anyway. If you have stories of your own or memories passed down from veterans of World War II, we would love to hear them in the comments below. Please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and give this video a like to support our work uncovering these forgotten histories. Thank you sincerely for listening.